like to start with a territorial acknowledgement, to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people of the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. I've learned recently that, I've heard Lekwungen people recently refer to themselves as saltwater people. And for those of you who are here, it's a little more difficult on the live stream. You know that we're surrounded by beauty and ocean and just a gorgeous place to be. The ocean is full of bounty, complex and beautiful social systems. And I often, when I'm walking around here, I often think about what this land would look like if we rolled back time through our current racist structures and systems, the 60s scoop, residential schools, colonization. What would this land look like? What would the people look like in the communities? Far different, I think, than we have today. And I suspect there wouldn't be a convening of a conversation on youth harm reduction. So we know that great damage has been done and continues to be done. And we have an obligation to do what we can as individuals, as organizations, and as people in our various professions, and as a society, to keep trying to do better. We must do better. Tonight we're talking about youth harm reduction, and as so many things do, Indigenous youth are far more highly represented in youth homelessness. Certainly within the context of our recovery programming at Threshold. We need to own that. We need to hold space for that and prioritize that we're using an Indigenous lens tonight as well. We can't ever let that go. And so with that, we will I'm happy to move on with welcoming some various people here. We have an elected official, Councillor Potts, is with us from Victoria City Council tonight. Thank you for being here, Councillor Potts. I want to acknowledge Threshold's lucky enough this week, Wednesday through Friday, we're right in the middle of it, to be co-hosting with the Way Home Canada, the national learning community on youth homelessness. In the room right now are over 30 organizations representing nearly all the provinces and territories, who are leading work in their communities. And we've come together to learn from each other and plan together. And I'm grateful for your time. And it's been a long day already, I know, and I'm grateful that you're here tonight. I know the sunshine is calling you, but you're here with us, so thank you. And so many other people in the room, you know, our donors, our partners, our funders, our board and staff, thank you for taking the time and having the interest to be here. And I do want to acknowledge we're live streaming this event. I think there's a couple hundred or more people who are joining us now from across Canada. And so we're thankful for that. We think this is a really important conversation that we need to start having, continue having, and making sure that it doesn't go away. Very quickly, Threshold Housing Society works with youth 15 to 24 years old in the context of safe housing, kind of robust supports and community. We work with young people who have invariable traumatic histories, who are coming from experiences of homelessness, experiences in the child welfare system, fleeing violence or abuse in their home. And you know, we try to offer them safety and housing and a place to heal and grow and build toward a sustainable and bright future. Why are we here specifically tonight to talk about youth harm reduction? Threshold works on the front lines with youth, many of whom are under the age of 19, who are struggling with serious and harmful substance use. They invariably have experiences of trauma in their life, as I mentioned, often very significant, life-altering, and painful experiences. Whether to help cope with pain of trauma or a variety of other reasons, some youth find themselves using substances. This often leads to a reality where young people are struggling with the harmful effects and are put in situations susceptible to further trauma and death. Many youth we work with at Threshold have a first age of youth or of use of 10, 11, 12 years old and have been using significant drugs for many years. So whether we like it or not, underage youth and young adults are using dangerous substances, and some are dying. We believe part of the reason for the unnecessary death is a lack of harm reduction services that are available for youth. Their adult counterparts have access to a much wider set of supports, particularly around harm reduction. And as the adult system moves forward with new policy announcements, new resource allocations, youth become further marginalized. It's fair to say that an adult struggling with substance, not that we are comparing one or the other, but have more options of support than an underage youth. How can that be? So we're here to provoke a conversation tonight. And we have some, I'm going to get out of the way now, and we're going to welcome up some incredible speakers and who are here with us. First, I want to acknowledge our moderator for the evening, David French. David is the managing director at Away Home Canada. And Away Home Canada is a national coalition reimagining solutions to youth homelessness through transformations in policy, planning, and practice. They're awesome. They're doing meaningful work that all of us are benefiting from across Canada. So, David, if you'd like to come up, and I'll mention too that our original moderator unfortunately fell ill and was unable to attend tonight. And so at lunch today, I walked over to David and said, "Hey, do you mind?" And he jumped at it without hesitation. I'm grateful for that. Okay, I'd like to welcome up each of our panelists to give just a brief introduction of yourselves and what brought you here tonight to speak on this topic. And I'll have a mic for you, and you can grab a seat. And then very excited to welcome Guy up for our keynote in a moment as well. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jennifer Charlesworth. Dr. Charlesworth is British Columbia's representative for children and youth. She was appointed as acting representative on August 31st, 2018, and confirmed in her appointment October 1st, 2018. Dr. Charlesworth has worked in the BC social and health sectors since 1977, and she's awesome.
It's lovely to be here with you this evening and to see humans in their entirety. So thank you so much for joining today. I have had the incredible privilege of working with young people since 1977. I celebrate 45 years in September. And I started out as a biologist, actually, and then back then, when I wanted to be an educator, they said, "You're never going to get a job." And then I met an amazing person named Dr. Penny Perry. And she introduced me to this whole notion of child and youth care, and I have never looked back, and the journey has been extraordinary. There's virtually every area of child and youth practice I've had the opportunity to do in this province and in other areas as well. And one of the things that's been so important in that journey is listening to the stories from young people and what their hopes, dreams, and aspirations are, and the ways in which our systems constrain them in being able to live a life of meaning and purpose and value and connection. So that has really imbued me with the desire to be a really good ally and advocate. And after 3 tries of trying to get the representative for children and youth job in the province of British Columbia, I wore them down, and I was appointed in 2018. And what a gift it's been, because this is sacred work to support our young people. It's absolutely sacred work. They are the most precious people in our society. And so what I do in the Representative for Children and Youth office fundamentally is bring all the teachings that I've had over many, many years to bear. We have an extraordinary team, and we do 3 things. One is we advocate and provide individual advocacy for those young people who are trying to navigate these complex systems of care. We receive reports from critical injuries and deaths of children, about 440 a month, of significant impact that young people are experiencing. And we review all of those, and we try and identify the ways in which we could be of support to the young people and what patterns and themes we need to pay attention to address the 3rd area, which is systemic change and a systemic advocacy that we do to try and affect the change to systems, structures, processes. So what brings me here in harm reduction is those very patterns that I see. We are seeing an incredible impact of the toxic drug supply on the lives of children and youth. It is the young people who are using, and it's the young people who are losing many important people in their lives as well. So the more that I have embraced this work and tried to understand and heard, most importantly, from the young people themselves, there's no question in my mind that harm reduction is absolutely critical to the toolkit that we need to create in order to support the well-being of our young people and lift them up to be good and great.
Thank you. Next, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Bernie Pauly to the stage. Dr. Pauly is a professor in the UVic School of Nursing, a scientist with the Canadian Institute for Substance Use Research, a member of the Renewal of Public Health Services Research Team, and a priority lead for the Canadian Observatory on Homelessness. Nice. Please come on.
So my background is I'm a registered nurse, and I started working in healthcare. One of the places I worked was the emergency department because I loved kind of fast-paced action. I liked being able to pivot and respond quickly. But I was stunned when I saw how people were treated who used substances when they came into the emergency department. They weren't they were dehumanized in some cases. I saw it from all members of the healthcare team. And I would think about my code of ethics. We had classes on the code of ethics, and the code of ethics said we treat everyone with respect and dignity, and that really meant something to me. It's what I thought I was supposed to be doing. And it wasn't what I saw happening. And that's actually what mobilized me to go into my graduate work. And but I didn't want to study what was wrong with healthcare because I had in there, and I didn't want to be part of that anymore. So what I did is I went to the community and I started doing research with inner city healthcare centers. And I was really interested in what street nurses were doing because it was showing that they were connecting with people, they were providing health services in a different way, and they were using a harm reduction approach. And that's really how I got introduced to it, was that way. I was introduced to harm reduction as relationship, I was introduced to it as connection, and I was introduced to it as love. And love sometimes in the context where people had not experienced love in their life. They had experienced a lot of trauma. And, my research since that time has really focused on looking at harm reduction interventions. Right now, we're leading some provincial evaluation of the prescribed safer supply guidelines. But back in my career, we mobilized the Canadian Nurses Association. I provided them with the evidence that supervised injection sites are an evidence-based intervention. They fit with our code of ethics. And the Canadian Nurses Association was an intervener in Insight. So, while I've been doing harm reduction research for about 15 years with really working with people of all ages to generate really good evidence about what does work and what we know works. But it's more than just giving someone, a clean needle or something. It's also about giving somebody a hug and knowing that somebody cares about you as well. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion tonight because we really need to love and care for our youth.
Thank you, Dr. Pauly. Next, I'd like to welcome Marlene Stevens to the panel. Marlene is from the Ktunaxa First Nation in southeastern BC. Marlene travels to Indigenous communities to talk about all things harm reduction. Marlene is invested in change and forward movement for Indigenous peoples and communities. Marlene's come to us today by way of prayer, tobacco, and energy, coupled with lots of intergenerational trauma and life itself.
Kisakukit, Hugakliklos, Husakalkukninaw Sanmietki. Good evening, everybody. My name is Marlene, and I'm from the Ktunaxa Nation in southeastern British Columbia. What brings me here tonight is I currently work for First Nations Health Authority, and we have an office in Oyster Bay, up in Nanaimo. And I started my work with First Nations Health Authority as a child and youth care coordinator. And I was really interested in the position. I have training back in a long time ago with early childhood education and teacher's assistant. And then I went on to do some work with the Anichi Institute in Alberta around harm reduction and addictions training back in 1999. And so the position for harm reduction coordinator came up with FNHA, and I moved over to this position about 13 months ago. And it is near and dear to my heart, as I'm a child who grew up on a First Nations reserve in British Columbia, did not always have drinking water, did not always have clean drinking water, and both my parents went to residential school. And when I was born, they were already heavy into their misuse of alcohol. And I grew up that way, and yeah, that brought me to want to work in the health organization, because as I came into this world as an Indigenous person, and that is my lens, that is my worldview, that is how I solve problems and look at solutions. So I'm super grateful to be here on this territory tonight, and grateful to sit and have a conversation with everybody here that's joining me and that's going to join us. And I hope that we have a really good discussion. And my favorite saying is that we are here to move the medicine. Now is the time and the place here for us, humanity, and for us here on Earth to move the medicine. So I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlene. And next, I'd like to welcome Kim Keats to the panel. Kim has worked with youth who struggle with mental health and addiction in both the public school system and in private treatment facilities since 1999. In 2018, after 2 years working as a psychiatric emergency nurse, Kim was selected to work with a newly created addictions medicine team within Kelowna General Hospital. Kim then went on to work with the Mobile Safe Injection RV, opioid agonist therapy clinic, and then several other incredible postings in Kelowna. A move to Victoria led her to her current nursing role at Island Health with an intensive case management team working with youth who use substances. Thank you for being here.
I am the nurse on the street that you referred to. I see them where they're at every single day, and I engage with them. And it is everything that everyone has said here. It is relationship, it is community, it's connecting, and it's developing that trust, and that trust is hard to get. Every single moment that we spend with these youth on the street, we are bringing something to them that they're beginning to depend on. And without harm reduction being community-wide, we're not succeeding. We have had death, and we've had 4 young folks die in the last year that are directly connected, either on our team or connected with our youth on our team. And that's just too many. It's too many because they can't get access to the services that they need. I come from Kelowna. I went into nursing late in my life. I worked in the school system for many years as an interpreter for the deaf, and then I worked in behavior intervention.
When I went into nursing, I started off in the emergency room as in the psychiatric department, traveling through the hospital, helping or working with an amazing addictions medicine team. And we started folks on OAT from an adult perspective. There was nothing for youth. I went into the very opening of the clinic, of the IO clinic in Kelowna, and then into the OAT clinic as well. And then I transferred here, and I was blessed to be selected for the YT5 team. The YT5 team is a new team. They've been going for about 3 years. And it's our goal to connect with those folks who are struggling to connect anywhere else.
Thank you, Kim. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker for tonight, Guy Felicella. Guy has spent 30 years in the repeated cycle of gangs, addiction, treatment, and jail. He spent nearly 20 years residing in the 2-block radius in the downtown east side and using many resources, including harm reduction, to keep himself alive. Guy is passionate about advocating for the vulnerable people who suffer in addiction and educating communities on harm reduction to eliminate the stigma that exists around it. Currently, Guy works for Vancouver Coastal Health, the Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction, and the BC Centre on Substance Use, and we are grateful to have you here to speak tonight, Guy, so please.
Thanks for having me. Thanks to the Threshold Society for putting on this great event. Obviously, it's a near and dear cause of mine. As a person who'd struggled really his whole life, to be able to be here to advocate for our youth, and not just our youth, but for everyone in society who ever struggles with stigma, discrimination, and racism that continues to exist in our society today. And I often talk about people don't need to be drug-free or sober to access proper services like healthcare, housing. But the reality is that if you're a substance user, the chances are that you won't be able to get these services. And what this does is it drives people into that isolation, and where they start to, withdraw from our society. And then we blame them for withdrawing or not reaching out for help. And so, one of the things that in our society we often reflect on is that our association with who uses substances. And so what isn't reality, or what society views substance use as, and what the truth is that this exists everywhere, and every community can impact anyone at any time. And there isn't a person out there, whether they're young or old, that's struggling, wants to be there. And yet our society ostracizes them and disconnects them. And for me in my life, that was the reality. More people die of illicit drugs than car crashes, homicides, suicides combined. Like, this is unbelievable what's happening in our society. And the sad part is that, we haven't done nearly enough to reduce the harms that are caused by those illicit substances. Sadly, already today, between 5 to 6 people are already gone. That's it. There's no chance at anything. There's no housing. There's no life. This impacts society, communities, their family, their friends, their neighbors. And then we have to pick up the pieces and carry. The biggest thing of where stigma comes from the government. It created it with the laws and policies rooted in racism. And those policies and laws viewed us, the general population, our view of how we're going to view people who use substances. This stigma then drives self-stigma, the stigma that I felt, the shame, the guilt, the sadness, the pain, all driven by structural policies that are in place today. Those same policies that exist in our society, rooted in racism, exist today in our society. I don't blame you or society for how you view substance use. I blame you for not educating yourselves on the root underlying issues of those policies. That's on you. We have to do the work to understand what's behind those policies. High school talks. This question here that I asked the kids, how many of you have been impacted by the overdose crisis? You see the hands? One hand's too many. I had a student come up to me after a high school talk. I say drug users aren't bad people, we just have challenging circumstances. In 2020, the 16-year-old's dad died of a drug overdose. And he said to me, I tell people he died of a brain aneurysm. My dad wasn't a bad person. He loved me. He just had a hard life. and he's gone. That broke me. This is a person who uses drugs. This was me years ago. Pain, trauma, abuse. Looked upon by medical practitioners as a person with a substance use disorder, mental health condition. But looked upon by society as a piece of garbage, a criminal, disposable, put him in jail, punish him. Imagine your only crime was that you were using drugs. That's it. To heal from the pain. Yes, this is a person struggling with pain, but this is not where it started. This is. I grew up in a middle-class home in Richmond, BC. A nice house, money. My father, my mother were well respected in the community. I have one brother, one sister. Everything looked normal from the outside. Inside, there was verbal abuse, physical abuse, alcoholism, gambling, and me trying to figure it out. Developed my anxiety, depression, self-hatred. You ever know what it is to wake up as a child and feel the hatred that you have for yourself because you're a failure? In school, I was called difficult, hard to manage, hyper. Put in a cubicle. Why can't you learn like everybody else? Everybody else gets it. I couldn't understand. My best response to people was, I don't know. So I was dumb, shame. Oftentimes I'd come home from school on a weekday, and our bags would be packed and we'd be leaving. We'd come over here. My grandmother lived here. She lived on Blanchard. And we stayed at her place. And then what happened after that is that we'd always go back. Things got better for a while, but then they'd get worse again. I navigated around my household knowing where the cracks in the floor were at a very young age. I call it like a soldier with a landmine field. It wasn't a matter of when or if it was going to go off. And so I'm trying to figure things out. I call my family there physically, but emotionally non-existent. I struggled. I had a hard time sleeping at night. I tried to function as a young person, going to school, looking for distractions. There's a difference between happiness and distracting yourself from the sadness. I was trying to distract myself from the sadness. And so I was good at sports. I excelled well. I enjoyed them. Baseball, soccer, hockey. I felt free. I didn't have to worry about what was going on. But unfortunately, with those instances that they only last an hour here, an hour there. And so eventually, I looked for ways and means to cope. And it wasn't getting better. I was getting worse as a person. I started having thoughts of ending my life. I didn't really feel like I needed to belong anymore. I didn't feel good in my skin. And I realized that in my household, things weren't going to change, and I was going to have to change them myself. And so I did. I started running away from home. And I kept getting brought back by the police. I would tell the police that I'm going to leave when you drop me off. They would drop me off. There's nowhere for you to go. You're going back home. And then by the time I was 12 years old, I found the greatest thing I ever found in my life. Street drugs. They took it away. It didn't matter what anybody was going to think anymore. I didn't care. It didn't matter what was going to happen in that household. Those street drugs just took it away. The freedom to actually have the ability to function through life. My challenges started there. I wasn't a social drug user. I was that drug user that was trying to numb the pain. I was always the guy that when stuff would stop, I'd want to have this desire inside to keep going. Why are you going home? We can find somewhere else. I can't stop. Who sleeps anymore? Unfortunately, with that, at a young age, things started to happen. Obviously, accessing substances, being on the street. Acceptance is one of the biggest things that our youth need. If you don't get it at home or you don't get it from a community, you will look for it. I found it in a gang lifestyle. These gangs were grooming me, much older. Grooming doesn't mean anything to a person that feels loved and accepted. It didn't matter. Somebody loved me when others didn't. Unfortunately, what happened with that is that it set off a new chain of events. And by the time that happened, police involvement, gang squad, by the time I was 14 years old, I was incarcerated for 1 year in the juvenile detention system. At the same time, my mom came to court and she made me a ward of the court, saying that all the issues that were happening in the household was due to the issues that I was just uncontrollable. Can you imagine being 14 years old and you find this out? I don't understand what ward of the court meant, but I remember the probation officer saying to me, it means you won't go back home. But tell that to a 14-year-old that they're not going to go back home. I still had a brother, I still had a sister. And as sad as it seems, even though you're in a dysfunctional familyhood, it was comforting. Strange way, because I knew what to expect. I knew how to navigate through that. While I was incarcerated, released, the drugs got harder, heavier. I was bounced around from group home to group home, school system to school system. The same unpredictable lifestyle at my home life was now the reality of my juvenile life, being moved around. Imagine that you get used to a place and comfortable, and then they move you to another place. And then you have to I had to figure out how you were as people, how you were going to treat me. And imagine that instability in a young person's lives who doesn't know how to cope. Undiagnosed learning disabilities didn't come until I was 37 years old. I felt the shame. I was dumb. I carried that my whole life. I started running away from those group homes. I started venturing into the downtown east side of Vancouver at a very young age. And in there, I found comfort. I found the beauty of knowing that other people were going through something that I was going through. Similar circumstances were different, but I could see the pain. I could relate to that. It's comforting to know that you're not alone, even if you're surrounded by people struggling with pain. And so we leaned on each other because nobody else cared. And as a youth in the downtown east side, it was very intimidating for me to sleep down there. So where I slept was in the Dunbar area, which is a very nice area of Vancouver, like very nice. But I used to sleep behind the Dunbar Community Center. And in the morning, I'd wake up and I'd go inside to their facilities and take a shower and then go back into the downtown east side. And then I started to understand how the street life works. And the drugs got faster and harder. I met some people. People were teaching me how the street worked. I was a survivor, and sadly, the beginning stages of my life, that survival that I had to learn as a child was going to be nothing compared to the biggest battle of my life. And so in the downtown east side, eventually I just never went back to Dunbar. I never left. And from 1983 to 1993, I was in and out of the downtown east side of Vancouver. And from 1993 to 2013, I never left the downtown east side of Vancouver. You can find me on the corner of Hastings and Columbia or Hastings and Maine. That's where I was, trying to figure it out. Pain. This is a person struggling with pain. Unaddressed pain piled on by trauma of a system. This is as bad as it got. I survived the first dueling public health emergency in British Columbia, which was the HIV/AIDS crisis and the overdose crisis, where 1 in 4 contracted HIV/AIDS in the downtown east side. I watched friends die from AIDS. I watched friends die from drug overdoses. We never did anything for the drug overdoses that happened in the 90s. I see the same eerie, familiar circumstances with the COVID-19 crisis and the drug overdoses crisis we're in. All the resources went into AIDS. All the resources went into COVID while substance users died. I survived decades of being homeless. I survived 5 osteomyelitis bone infections, 4 in my left leg, 1 in my back, where I had to relearn how to walk again. Pain. The struggle inside to live. Booth 5, February 18th, 2013, at the supervised consumption site. The last time I overdosed. I woke up on the ground between 7 to 10 minutes. It took to bring me back. It was one of the longest overdoses at that facility at that particular time. And that's when fentanyl started to hit the streets in 2012, and I was actively purchasing it. When I woke up, I looked over and the nurse was crying. And I asked her, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because I care, Guy." And I just started to cry. I told her I don't want to do this anymore. Physically, mentally, I was slower. My speech was slurred. Did it go too far? I remember that I actually have to think to put my foot in front of the other to walk. On compassionate grounds, they took me up to the 2nd floor, which is the detox facility. Because they knew that if they let me go, that I wouldn't be back in the morning. And I stayed there and they monitored me and the journey began. This is how harm reduction and recovery work together in my life. It's a relay race. You know, the baton passing on the same team with the same objective in mind, to help people, to support people. You know, oftentimes we pit one against the other. Gone are the days where it's and or it's both. I don't support harm reduction over recovery, and I don't support recovery over harm reduction. I support people. There's a difference. I don't get that confused. You meet people where they're at, you support them, you give them all the options. It's their journey. I'm just the taxi driver. That's all we are. We're a bunch of cab drivers to help people. And if harm reduction didn't exist, then I wouldn't exist. These kids wouldn't exist. These families wouldn't exist. This is not just a one-off. The gratitude that I have for harm reduction for allowing me to be a dad today wouldn't have happened. all these children came after. Not before. They came after. And I'll tell you something that we all have as people, that something is often more powerful than you ever think it is, often overlooked, often not thought about, was what changed the direction of my life? It was human connection. That changes the direction of our lives, to be accepted for who we are as people, to be loved, not judged, not punished, to be welcomed. I describe supervised consumption sites as basically the theme song of Cheers when I walked in the door. I might have been Norm. Everybody knew my name. It was a welcoming environment that bridged the gap for me to access other services. And when I got to a spot in my life where the drugs didn't work, because the drugs worked for so long in my life until they didn't, the same drugs that saved my life were now the same drugs trying to end it. And I saw it. I was diagnosed with ADD. I cried. I shared with the specialist that I just thought I was stupid. She said, "Oh, Guy, no. You've had to live your whole life with not knowing. Awareness of who I was as a person, the trauma that I had buried." I was sharing with Bernie over dinner, does the pain or the trauma ever go away? Does the anxiety or the depression ever go away? But we learn how to cope. I started to understand my relationship with those drugs. And then I didn't need them anymore. That took 31 years, not 3 months. That took a lifetime of learning about who I am as a person. Yet everybody wants results. You want to know what the results are? Don't celebrate the outcome. Celebrate trying. When you celebrate trying, people are motivated to keep trying. We're all trying in this world. I'll share with you probably one of the most powerful stories of human connection that I could ever share with anybody. It's my grandmother, who lived out here. She loved me. She knew all the stuff that I was going through. And when I started to venture into the downtown east side, it really limited my contact with her. But every year, twice a year, she got on a Greyhound bus onto the ferry, came to the downtown east side and found me, usually around my birthday or around Christmas. And she'd take me out to eat, and she'd give me a card with some money. She never judged me or told me that I needed to do this or I needed to do that. Do you know what she always said? "I keep telling them you're going to figure it out. They think I'm crazy." "You're going to figure it out, Guy." She loved me. That's what she did. And as time passed and she got sicker and she couldn't always come by to see me, she would send a card to the supervised injection site with money in it. Who sends money in the mail anymore? She did. Old school. And I'd open the letter and I'd cry. Moments of hope. Thinking about you. Love you. Happy birthday. Merry Christmas. Twice a year. Without failure. In 2013, when I left the downtown east side of Vancouver and I met my wife, in November of that year, she became pregnant with our first child. And at the same time, my grandmother was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, and she was moved into palliative care, and she was given 2 weeks to live. Obviously, the early stages of pregnancy you don't announce publicly, but we thought, well, she's going to go in 2 weeks. We'll tell her. I walked into that palliative care room, and boy, what an emotional conversation that was. The tears She was over the moon. And then she said this, I can't wait to meet my great-grandchild. And I just kind of looked at her and I was like, that's not possible. I'm not good at math, Grandma, but you got like 2 weeks to live. And it's 9 months away. It's not like happening next week. And she squeezed my hand and she said, no, I'm going to stay. And I just was kind of like, okay, you stay. And so daily, my wife and I, we showed up at palliative care, 7 p.m. for her 2 favorite shows, Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, Black Starbucks coffee, and highly competitive game. And a month had passed. And I remember the nurses were coming up to us and, the cancer was spreading. They were saying to me that, she's a fighter. I said, I know about fighting. And 3 months had passed. And you see the pain, the will, somebody trying to will themselves. We found out it was a boy. We got the ultrasound. 4 months now. We raced back. We named him Noah. She was holding the ultrasound like she was holding him. And she loved the name. She says, it's a strong name, Guy. And the emotional roller coaster ride of watching somebody, different dynamics of the day, how she was going to feel, if the call was going to come. 9 months later, we wheeled her out of palliative care, and she held her great-grandchild, Noah, for the first and only time. The will, the human nature to live against all odds is in all of us, even the people that we see out there. What my grandmother had taught me was just how powerful human connection is to people. By showing up, by sending a card, by letting me know how much I meant to her. The moments of hope. My grandmother showed me I was just repaying it forward by showing up at 7 o'clock. I didn't understand that. She taught me that. A couple days later, I came back to see her and I could see the impacts of cancer and the toll that it had taken on her, the pain that she was in. I said, I'm not coming back anymore. I don't want to see this anymore. And she said, I had to stay. I had to make sure that you were going to be okay. I had to witness the miracle. Noah, that's not supposed to happen. I just told her, you let go. And thanks for always being there. I'll never forget you. And then a short time later, we'd gotten the call that she had passed. I've never forgotten her compassion, non-judgmental attitude. She loved me. And she taught me how to love back. She taught me how I was worth it. Imagine if we can do that for many others. People are worth it. Whether they use drugs or not, they're people. Where's our humanity? This is some of my social media handles where I post stuff. One of the biggest things that changed my life was trauma therapy and being able to access it. The awareness of the diagnosis. The awareness that I was using substances because I was trying to numb the pain, because the pain was unbearable. You can understand when you see people behind the story. You have to understand the story of the person. And when you do, you understand why they would use the way they use. I often reflect this too to people. I've been to treatment many times. I was often associated with a failure because I couldn't complete treatment. But nobody thought of celebrating that trying incident. I just kept getting back up. I kept getting knocked down. I kept getting back up. In our society, we treat people who are off drugs better than we treat people who are using them. That's a shame. That's the same person. The beauty of people. This doorway. This is the doorway that I used to sleep in the downtown east side. It's right across from the West Hotel. It's on Carroll Street. This is my spot. I slept there 9 years ago last Christmas. I was in that doorway sleeping. Cold. Christmas Day. Some random lady rolled up, woke me up, gave me a coffee, $50, and had to kneel down and give me a hug and say Merry Christmas. And she got up and she walked away. I've never seen her again, but I've never, ever forgotten what she did. And I have so many questions for her. Was that your coffee? Or did you see me and then go buy a coffee and come back? What if I was gone? What motivated you to give me $50? Most people just would walk by. What stopped you? Did you have somebody in your family that struggled? I don't know. But all I know is this, is that people will never forget how you made them feel. They'll never forget that. You only get one shot. And remember this when you're dealing with anybody struggling. If they come to your service to ask for help, it's not just you and them. It's you, them, and every traumatic experience that they've ever gone through in their life, and show a little bit of kindness to that person and understand that they have been traumatized by systems in place that have existed far too long in our society. And we as people have to change that to change, demand any government that's in power to change it, to treat people like people. 10 years ago, I was on Vancouver Police Department's most wanted list. Well, guess what? 2020, I was Vancouver Magazine's top power 50 list of influential people. People change when they're supported. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Guy, for the gift of your story today. And I'm just, I know I'll speak for many when I just say grateful for your voice and your impact and your life. Thank you for being here tonight with us. I don't even know what I'm supposed to do now. I'm going to pass it over to my friend David, who's going to start the panel. And so take it away.
Thank you. I'd like to also thank you for the education you provided us tonight. I think we're all better for the opportunity to hear even the words of Celebrate Trying in this moment of a post-pandemic reality, challenges with our young people, the realities of big systems not doing what they need to do to support young people, but yet the whites of the eyes of these people in this room who in their everyday work celebrate trying. And so thank you for that. I have the privilege of asking a number of questions, some of them loaded. And if you're ready, we'll just roll right to it. In the context of harm reduction, and this is to anybody on the panel, can we frame the difference around harm reduction for young people and harm reduction for adults? Who wants to take that first?
Well, I mean, I just say that it doesn't matter whether you're an adult or a youth. If you think about stigma when it exists, if that we're going to stigmatize our youth, then we're going to stigmatize them as adults. And so, harm reduction isn't an approach that has a required age. That's not how it works. It works to support people. And so I think our challenges in our society is that youth don't have enough harm reduction services to access to actually build the relationship. When I talk about human connection, that's what harm reduction gave people. I was already using the substances, whether you liked it or not, I was already using them. And so allowing me to actually go into a facility as a youth. There was a facility in the downtown east side when I was 16 years old that I accessed, and it was called DAS. And, I'd show up there at 8 a.m. and it was open from 8 a.m. till 4 p.m. And I slept there from 8 a.m. till about 4 p.m. on their couch. And they would feed me, big bowls of cereal. But every day at 4 o'clock, it was like it built the connection, the start of something. And I trusted those people because when you think about it, harm reduction services for youth is a trust thing for youth, because once the youth start to trust people that are not judging them for using drugs or not, nobody ever told me to actually stop. They just said when I was ready or asked that, hey, I need some help to kind of do something different, then they gave me the options. And when I had those options, I was like, oh, okay, I'll try that. And I would try it. And that was the start. I always say this, just because I was using substances didn't mean that I wasn't trying recovery either. Not because, recovery is just an approach that means something to the individual. It's not like, a standard approach to some people that can be abstinence off drugs. For me, it has to be. I can't use drugs and do life at the same time. I really had to pick one. So for me, but the access for youth is just absolutely important. And we fail. We've failed that they don't have the proper services. So.
Over to you.
Thank you. And maybe I'll add to that, because I'm of the same persuasion that I think it's actually harmful for us to start to distinguish harm reduction for youth and harm reduction from adults as if they're very different bucket of services, in large part because harm reduction, and I think and the reason I want to challenge that is that those kinds of binaries actually prevent us from thinking about the ways in which we support the person where they're at and what they need. And at least in our experience, and when I released a report in 2018, Time to Listen, and called for youth harm reduction, one of the things that people said is that, I had quite an array of options, of responses, but there was a tremendous pushback of how dare you talk about youth harm reduction for youth? And I thought, well, they're going to grow into adults, So why would we not be engaging in a meaningful and relational way to figure out where are they at? And I think there was something in people's psyche that makes them fear engaging with youth in a harm reduction way. And I think we have to really challenge that there is a fundamental difference. Harm reduction is about reducing the harms in a compassionate, relational way, so that a person can live in the way in which is most aligned with their goals, aspirations, and dreams, and to pick up on what you've said so beautifully, Guy, to help them deal with the emotional pain that is so often at the root of their experiences with substances. So that's just a perspective of, I think it's harmful if we start to distinguish too clearly youth and adults.
So in our day-to-day travelings around Victoria, there is a absolute hard line between what adults can access and what youth can access. We struggle connecting them with the OAT. There's only one agency that the youth can go to be prescribed an OAT, a methadone or a Suboxone. There's no place for them to go and use their substances in a safe manner. They were hiding in alcoves and dying. They were using in rooms and their housing sites and dying. It's a struggle every day for our team to go out there and connect with services for our kids. There isn't we can distribute. We can distribute supplies or needles, tubes, whatever they're looking for. But that's not the same thing. We need to provide them a safe place to go. They need to be believed in. They need to find that connection with someone, and we don't have a place for that to happen. They can go to get a meal, absolutely. They can go to connect to treatment options and fill out an application. But at the end of the day, they need a place to use their substances, and they're being chased away. They're being chased from downtown areas that they used to be able to go to during the pandemic because no one was down there. So there is a difference. There is a hard line between accessing safer and accessing quality OAT medication, because you can't fight fentanyl with Suboxone. It's just not possible. And we're just not there yet. And I wish we were. I wish that there was a magic wand and that these folks that we work with every day have a place to go, but they just simply don't.
I really appreciate what everybody is saying up here. I believe that it's so important that we need to move away from the stigma that we've created for the adults in our lives that are substance misusing, because we are transferring that pain and shame onto our children. And that's not going to help, because we know from the data, we know from the numbers, the amount of people that are dying in our lives every single day.
I think there's been so many excellent points made, and I think what I would add to the discussion is that the principles are the same. It's about acceptance. It's about being non-judgmental. It's about recognizing that we made a choice in 1908 to criminalize drugs. And when we did that, what we said is we're also criminalizing and creating this idea of drug users, and that somehow they're bad. But I think, Guy, you made such a beautiful point about you're the same person whether you're in treatment or you're using substances, and we've been taught that, and we're all living that. And so harm reduction comes in as this kind of shifting of that kind of perspective to say, yeah, I know everybody out there thinks you're bad. I know that, everybody thinks you're worthless, that you're a waste of time, but I don't actually think that. Kim, I think about your team. You're telling people that every day. And there's several people raised the lack of youth services. And, we have adult services, but we need youth-friendly services where they feel safe to go. And what I would also add is it's not just it's services in the community, but when we think about youth housing for youth that have been homelessness, we absolutely need to have that recognition and acceptance that youth are using substances, and therefore we need to have harm reduction services in housing as well. And that opens up a whole different, I think, conversation, because youth shouldn't have to be clean and not using drugs in order to get access to housing. So it's pretty fundamental piece of it.
We know there's a link between childhood trauma and substance abuse. And some of the language that's out there now within the sector is trauma-informed care. Talk to us about the link between trauma-informed approaches and harm reduction for young people.
I was telling Guy and Bernie just before we started our conversation that I had a wonderful opportunity to go to an Indigenous ceremony last night. And when I went to the ceremony, it was a sweat lodge ceremony, and it was in the middle of nowhere. There was no water, there was no lights. And when I went to the sacred ceremony, within our circle was a boy, and he may have been 8 years old. And then there were some youth who, when I worked at a school in Comox, they were one of my students, and she was in grade 8. And she was there today, 20 years old, someone who had just lost her mom. And there was another young lady who was raised up in MCFD care. And what an honor to be able to have them come sit inside the sweat lodge with me. They stayed in the sweat lodge as long as they could, and they came and went as they pleased. But they were honored by the older people that were there for their presence, because they were there, they were included. There was no, this is an adult sweat. There was no, this is a sweat for the youth. They were just welcomed. And they just came and they watched. They watched me, how I conducted myself at this ceremony. I had a blessing that I had one of my children be able to watch me as I walked in this ceremony, and the way that I carried myself and the way that I interacted with these people. It was a good way of talking about inclusion and supporting and meeting people where they're at and not having that division. Because as this 8-year-old boy had decided that, boy, I want to sit down and have a conversation with my ancestors today. And I, an older person, had also decided that I want to sit down and have a conversation with my ancestors today. Really, really good times.
Thanks, Marlene. That was, I'm just sitting and reflecting in it, and you know what, we can get these definitions of trauma-informed care, but I think which, you know, as you've shared with us through that story and the acceptance and the connection is so much part of it, which is like what we've been saying about harm reduction. And the one story I wanted to share was I met a woman who was living in a park, because I don't know if you know this in Victoria, but there, at the beginning of COVID, there wasn't much room in the shelters because they had to decrease due to physical distancing, and there weren't spaces. And I kind of got to know her a little bit. And one time she said to me, she said, you know, she said, I've suffered physical abuse, I've suffered verbal abuse, I've suffered sexual abuse, and in order to get services, I shouldn't have to tell people that. She said more in those two sentences about what trauma-informed care means than all of the articles and books, and I really think that aligns so beautifully in terms of harm reduction, because I don't have to tell you everything about my substance use in order to get services, or I don't have to be not using substances, but you need to treat me and recognize that there is trauma there. So the two fit, in my mind, really well together. And her definition is the one that I use the most all the time.
Don't turn your mic off, Dr. Pauly. This next one's coming to you.
Ooh.
You mentioned the link between housing and harm reduction. So can we then juxtapose what harm reduction means for shortening experiences for young people who are homeless, or preventing them or ending them altogether?
Yeah, I wrote a paper a while ago, about 10 years ago, actually in 2013, Guy, about what's the role of harm reduction in ending homelessness. And Guy, when you said it's a bridge, I just had this sort of immediate visual metaphor of the bridge of the supervised consumption site to on-site to the next, you know, steps that you went through, right? And that was the connection. Because treatment sets this bar way up here, right? And that's, you know, yes, we can celebrate trying that, and we should always have that option open, but that we don't have to start there. We can start in the bridge. And so I think a lot of times, you know, there's a lot of harms of also being homeless, right? And that just makes the cycle worse and worse and worse. And so if harm reduction services can help connect people, you know, like Guy was describing, and, you know, and I see this a lot because a lot of my work is at the intersection of harm reduction and homelessness. And so what I see a lot is people go, wow, okay, I'm in this housing, I'm in this place. I don't have to, I'm not sleeping in a doorway. I'm not fighting for survival every day. You know what? I can do something different, right? I can make some different choices that day to be in a different way. And it moves people through to where they want to be in their lives. So I think that connection is really important.
Other thoughts?
Thank you. And I'd love to build on that because that's one of the things that we see is thinking about when a young person is housing, their housing or their food security is unstable, then we add to the vicious cycle of the trauma that's been experienced in their lives in many situations, and housing and some safe, secure, respectful, and supportive environments and housing can enhance a person's sense of agency and control over their lives in such a way that, as you're saying, Bernie, then it's like, okay, now what? What else might be possible? So though I think housing and thinking about housing security and food security as well is such an important part of thinking about harm reduction writ large. And I think somebody said, harm reduction when we first started thinking about it was things like clean needles and safe supplies. But it's so much more as we're learning about harm reduction as a relational practice. And thinking about what's happening for that young person, what's happening for the individual, what is it that's going on in their lives, and then what are the things that make sense for them given what's going on. And housing, in my experience, thinking about so many of the young people that, for example, that have gone into encampments. The reason that they're in encampments is because they've been given ultimatums by the structures and the systems that are supposed to be caring for them. It's like you have to be sober, you have to not be using, in order to get housing. Well, all behavior makes sense if you understand the backstory. And for many young people, much as you were talking about earlier, the use of substances is actually an act of resistance and an act of self-care, given what's happened to them. So to then issue ultimatums to say you aren't going to get housing if you use substances, or being kicked out and going through the foster care cycle over and over and over again, actually contributing to the trauma and the harms. And that is not harm reduction, and that is not trauma aware or trauma attuned. So I think housing is one of those key pieces that we have to put in, and sometimes before any of these other things.
Marlene, help round out this listening journey for us in the context of harm reduction through an Indigenous lens for young people.
Hey, David. One of the things that I know for sure today is that far too many Indigenous youth are experimenting with substances of all kinds. And if anybody out there knows, I had just said experimenting. Because when our young people start, it doesn't matter what color, what race, but what they're doing is experimenting. Somehow, as we've gotten older as a society, we have forgotten that rites of passage of experimenting. When we were Indigenous communities before colonization happened, we lived in a huge community, sometimes 1,200 people to a longhouse. And there were lots of community support around. There was no housing issue back then. Nobody was getting kicked out. Everybody learned how to live together. There was harmony, there was love, there was care, there was kindness, and there was guidance. We guided our young people. I watched as this young boy watched me last night at the ceremony. And I was like, my goodness, we tonight are sitting here and we're guiding each other. This 8-year-old boy is guiding me as I guide him in a way of having, one way of having a good life. It's so important for all youth, in particular Indigenous youth, to feel that connection. There was a time when we practiced our ceremonies. We had our sun dances, we had our potlatches, we had our naming ceremonies. One of the things when I go into communities as a harm reduction educator, I let the communities know that I'm here to talk about the way that we used to care for one another. Let's remember our kinship laws, the way that we used to care for one another. How did we care for those ones that were not well? We didn't kick them out. We didn't say, you're not well, you can't be here. We didn't say, you're not 5'2", you can't be here. We didn't say, you're this, you're that, you can't be here. We loved and we cared and we kept that connection and we kept it strong right until the time that they transitioned to the spirit world. We keep that connection going. And it's so important when the kids know now, we see here on Vancouver Island in particular, the importance of the children who get to go to school and they're learning their languages. They're learning Senchothan here in these communities. They're learning Hulkaminam. They're learning Hulkamilam. They're learning the languages of their people, because the way that when you speak a different language, things mean different. Things are more greatly expanded than just a simple yes and a simple no. And the control, because I think when we talk about harm reduction and we talk about abstinence, we're talking about control. And when we find the words, we will find out that we need to let go of some of our control. We need to trust in our youth that they have the ability to figure it out, as Guy said. And Guy has proven to us that they do have the ability to figure things out, but we need to be able to be there to guide them and to suggest, but also to accept that no is an answer. When they say no, they may use drugs harder and longer. But if we put that faith and that trust in them, that yeah, things are going to be okay, and you are going to sort it out, you are going to figure it out. And we have a whole community. Everybody sitting here in the audience and people in Zoom land or wherever you are, we are all the community for these young people. They are our future. It's been said time and time again, and I hope tonight that more words land on the ears and more action is taken. And that action is too simple around love and care and kindness for our youth. And to disconnect, to connect. I know that FNHA has funded programs where the youth get to go back out on the land. I know that some school districts are moving towards land-based healing, which is a beautiful thing because it's getting our kids back to nature, back to what we used to do, play in the dirt all day was one of my healing methods, playing in the dirt, swimming for hours on end. So I think it's really important to remember who we are and where we come from as Indigenous people. We're very blessed today that many things are unfolding, that we get to have a stronger path and a stronger ability to remember our indigeneity. And we are very blessed to be able to walk on this earth at this time with all of our non-Indigenous relatives and friends and family and community, because it is all of us that are listening here today that are going to help these young people overcome these issues, overcome their hurts, whatever's sat on their heart. We lived in a different time. Today, what's sat on their heart is Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, all of that stuff. Take some time to learn what's hurting their hearts and help them and guide them in the best way that we can. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I sit here today, I sat in a bureaucrat seat, and I had an opportunity to write provincial policy. And I used the language of harm reduction within that piece of policy. And I'm certain they forgot to read that page because I didn't think they would keep it in. How do we continue to socialize, bring awareness to the language of harm reduction specific to young people? And how do we ensure that parents, caregivers, teachers, school boards, service providers can be comfortable with the language?
Yeah, that's a tall ask, but it takes a lot of advocates and advocating and a lot of awareness. One talk doesn't change people's values and beliefs, but however, many talks and awareness, oftentimes people often said to me is that, well, harm reduction actually enables people to continue using substances. And I was like, yeah, but I was already using substances before harm reduction even actually was a word. And so harm reduction, actually the first encounter of harm reduction in my life from a care provider was Liz Evans in the downtown east side. And it was right on where I slept in that doorway across the street was the Pennsylvania Hotel. And it was like 1992. And she said, "What's wrong?" And I'm like, "Well, I can't find a syringe." And then she just went into her bag and she said, "I've got some." And she handed me a syringe. She handed me water. And I just stared at her and I was just like, "Oh, well, how do I?" And she was like, it was the first time that somebody actually ever gave me something to use safer. And she said, "Listen, it doesn't matter if you use substances, you should be able to access proper health care." And I was like, yeah. And to be honest with you, it was the first time that somebody ever did that. And take it from a guy that literally, I've had to break into storerooms at St. Paul's Hospital in the late 80s and early 90s to grab a syringe. And then I was arrested for break and enter. And I remember even going to court and saying to my lawyer, I was like, "How is that break and enter? The door was open. And like, I just grabbed the syringes but that's the reality is that our society views harm reduction where it started from as, and this is how harm reduction was implemented. It's because nobody in society actually cared. So drug users had to do the caring. That's where it originated from. Now what's happened is this somewhat watered down version that society likes to have. But if you go back to its roots of when it started, and I always talk about historical context, that's why harm reduction, because we got sick and tired of waiting, thinking that you were going to actually do something. So we were like, we got to actually take care of ourselves. And so that's what even happens today in our society is that substance users look after, we hear talk about diversion. You know what I say about diversion? It's not called diversion. It's called love, caring. Every time I overdose, do you know what the street would say? They would come up to me like, "Hey, I got some key that I couldn't access." And when you actually think about that, that's the root cause of harm reduction. It's love, it's caring. It's saying that, you know what? They won't help, we will. And that's really what exists today. And if you look at all the things that's going on in our society today with this, the drug supply will increasingly get worse. There is no heroin. It's gone. It's now synthetic fentanyl. That's it. Finding heroin is like looking for a needle in a haystack. And if we don't, and now it has benzos in it. So not only does people get, wired to fentanyl, they get wired to benzos. And then you try accessing any service after that. Try getting into detox if you wanted to. Now you need a medical detox because you need a nurse 24 hours there. So that takes longer. So there's these wait lists. And essentially what we're saying with these wait lists is that it turns into a death list. I often tell a coroner this, is that how many people died trying to access services before? How many people tried to access safer supply and they couldn't get it? How many people tried to access housing and were on a wait list before they died? And I tell you something, back to the homelessness part, is that homelessness, and take it from a guy that slept on concrete for 20 years, my body is like punished. And you sleep on hard surfaces for a long time. My wife, I have to have a hard bed because my wife's like, well, sure he does. He has to sleep on the street his whole life. It can't be soft because his body will it's brittle, and that's punishment. And it's not so much what you see in the community of even here in Victoria. That's not a drug issue. You want to know what that is? That's us not addressing poverty. And when you don't address poverty, people will use substances because we need to numb the pain of that. And so it's us not doing enough and allowing it to go like this. And then it's just easier to blame the person for not doing anything when it's really the systems of care.
Can I pick up on the thread of love and caring for a minute? I love the language around love and caring and trauma, and specifically around harm reduction. So Kim, beyond love and caring, what are the examples that you can think of around harm reduction for young people at the street level? What does it look like?
In our community, there is our team, the YT5 team, and we have between 25 and 35 clients at a time. Harm reduction to our team is helping those folks access, services. It's about making relationships. It's about connecting with, for example, Forbes Pharmacy. They will do anything for our clients. They will source medications. They will give us the bottom basement deal. They'll often give it to us at no cost. It's making that connection for our kids. What we're seeing is, for example, I'll walk you through today. I came into work this morning. I had a taser wound that had developed cellulitis. Our folks do not want to go into urgent care because it's painful for them and traumatizing for them. So we're trying to treat this young person's cellulitis with pictures, and we're texting them to a doctor to try and get some antibiotics. Once we complete that, then I went on and treated a case of lice. Our client had no access to have a shower, so we then had to source a place to have a shower. It was almost to the point where I was asking my manager for a hotel room so that I could take this young person in and just let them have a shower. And so once we found a place for this young person to go, we had to then figure out medication because it costs money. So again, Forbes Pharmacy steps up to the table, and we got the medication for her lice and treated that. So then it goes on. So the next part is, what are we doing for hepatitis C? Because our youth have hepatitis C that's untreated because they cannot go into the labs to have blood draws because it's traumatizing for them. So I'll have a youth who is a year and a half now with positive hepatitis C and no treatment. So then you have to think out of the box. You don't just have to think out of the box. You have to think, make a new box and think outside of that box. So then I go to our community partner, Kool-Aid, and they're willing to come in. But it takes so long. You have to make the phone call. You have to plead the case. You have to wait for their response. And then they step up to the table. But our youth, they can't access the Kool-Aid van. They can't access street-level medical care. They have me. That's who they have. They have my partner, Tessa. And then we have brilliant case managers and social workers who work tirelessly to connect them to services. But we struggle every single day. And then we deliver OAT. We deliver OAT out of our car windows to our folks who are panhandling on meridians. And that is a daily occurrence for us. We're looking for these youth every day to provide that harm reduction, that connection, that care. And it takes so long and it's so hard. And our team steps up to the plate every single time.
Love it. Thank you. To elevate this dialogue, real-time practical solutions are necessary for us to continue to talk about. But I'm also wondering what's happening in the research. What's new and innovative that's coming out of the research that could help give permission, shift thinking, and establish a new narrative for harm reduction for young people?
I'm just sort of, I've got a lot of things running through my head here, David. And, I think we've actually kind of traversed some of the history of harm reduction through this conversation. And, we've had a lot of research around, the benefits of providing safer supplies to prevent Hep C, to prevent HIV. And, through the 80s and the 90s, and even later, what a fight it was. We had the research, but we didn't have the policy. Because a lot of, and I just got a comment on that page of policy. I've looked at so many policies in my research, and often it's a little set of principles that are completely disconnected from what Guy and Kim and Marlene have been saying about what it's really like and what it really needs to look like. And that's coming out of the research. We got these principles disconnected from the evidence. And so then we move from this research around safer supplies, we make some gains, and then we have to have the same fight all over again around safer spaces. Insight, which Guy saved your life, I can say that, right?
Oh, yeah.
It saved Guy's life. That took provincial court cases, it took federal court cases. And even when those court cases were won, in I'm going to say it was about 2016, we had already declared public health overdose emergency. We knew that if we scaled up supervised consumption sites, that would help. We knew that. But you know what? People were told that they couldn't set them up. They had to go through all these rules and regulations from Health Canada. And then when people did try to set them up, I'm thinking of the one, Guy, about August 2016 on the Surrey Strip, people nearly lost their jobs over that. Mm-hmm. People, they were taken down, they were criminalized. And we already had the evidence. So, when we ask about the research, part of it is the policy's not keeping up with the research. And now where we're at, if you want to talk about what's new, our team is working very much around generating more evidence to support safer supply. During COVID, there was some policies introduced so that people could get access to opioids and stimulants as in addition to things like Suboxone. And so, one of the physicians in our research talked about the fact that, a lot of people say there's not enough evidence to do this, but we're in a public health emergency where, we've got 6 to 7 people dying a day, including youth. And I think you've probably seen the coroner's report where the numbers of youth are increasing. And we have things that we can use. We can have tools and resources, but we're not using them. And then when people who use drugs implement those things themselves. And let me tell you, since the beginning of the public health overdose emergency, overdose prevention sites, every kind of innovation that we have around compassion clubs would be another example. They've come from people who use drugs. So we often have the research. What we don't have is the uptake in policy, and that's well demonstrated. So we've got to get the policymakers with Guy and Kim and Marlene.
The crisis within the crisis. We've often heard this around the overdose crisis. How do we get in front of overdoses for young people?
Lighthouse has created a housing site for youth, and it is safe. And the youth can go there and live, and they're provided food, they're provided access to filling in applications, and our team is welcome there, Foundry is welcome there. That's the first step, because they're seen by someone, these youth. The second step from our team's perspective is developing that community relationship. So getting access to appropriate medication for the level of substances that these youth are using. And there's a stumbling block there. There's a road bump because it's hard for prescribers and doctors and nurse practitioners to prescribe outside the guidelines. And that's what I ask for all the time. And they're very kind about it, but the answers are still, we're not there yet. If you're an adult, you have access to fentanyl patches and buccal fentanyl. We don't have access to that for our youth. The parameters around them going in, they have to go to SAFER. SAFER is a study and it's not designed necessarily for youth. We do have a couple of 19-year-olds, but the access is the problem for them. So it's policy. Policy is getting in the way of saving lives. And I don't know how to get around it. I just don't know. And we have the housing, we're developing community relationships, but we still have that use of fentanyl. We can't compete. We're losing. We're losing on our side.
If we don't actually do something, what we're doing is we're passing it on to the generation in the rearview mirror. And that's what we're allowing. So we're allowing the trauma that youth have to deal with to be passed on and on and on. And really what's happened is like what everybody said here is that we're good at meeting policies where they're at. We're not good at meeting truly where people are at. And that's the challenge. And that's why, harm reduction is still, when it was implemented, it was criminalized. You were a criminal. Well, the first supervised consumption site, which is actually not North America's first supervised consumption site, it existed in 95 and 96, which was on Dunlevy. I used to use that facility. And it was just basically a couch with a bed sheet over, but it was a safe place. And when the police raided it, I was incarcerated for using it. I didn't have any drugs on me just because you're always branded this criminal because it was against the law. But it's kind of like that saying, it's that if somebody's stealing because they're hungry, is that really stealing? It's kind of like if same thing with if there's no services for people to access, if we don't have regulated sites, we have unsanctioned sites that people use. And these are what substance users will have to resolve to protect themselves. And so that's what happens with our youth, is that already at a very young age, they're stigmatized and they're using alone in isolation. And really, what has to happen as well is that you have to have open and honest conversations with your kids. And guess what? If you've gone too far, I've talked to parents that went the road that when they found out they were using drugs, that it came with punishment. You're grounded. You can't see your friends and all that. I would talk to the parents and I'd say, it's okay to go back to your kid and apologize, saying, hey, I was a little bit harsh. Really, what I was trying to say is that I love you and I'm scared to death. And I don't want anything to happen to you because I don't know what I would do. But you're right. Let's learn together. If we learn together, especially with our youth, and have their input, empowering youth. I always say to youth when I'm talking to them, I hope I'm talking to the future prime minister in this room, that you will actually do what's necessary to make the changes. I'm banking on you to get somewhere, to do something, to say something. And even one of the main questions that youth ask me about policy is that if they know it's rooted in racism, then why does it still exist today? And I said, that's a good question for you to ask. So our youth are very smart. When you give them all the information, they'll pick it apart. They're brilliant. And we just need to do better to support them and allow them to be outspoken, to have boundaries, to say boundaries, to set boundaries, to be able to speak boundaries without us. I always find this, our emotional intelligence is really what gets in the way of listening to somebody else. It's that we feel like we're slighted. Well, guess what? If a youth is trying to say something to you, maybe you're not listening. I've said this too in the downtown east side to anybody that I do training models with. If somebody throws coffee on you, it's a really bad day and they didn't mean it. If somebody throws coffee on you twice, then you better change your approach to how you're talking to people, because nobody gets coffee thrown on them twice.
I saw you reaching for the mic, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. The other thing, just as you were talking, Guy, I wanted to speak in the importance of the people around the young people. And one of the things that we keep talking about is that in this province, we do not have a robust array of voluntary supports and services for our young people so that they can, enter into caring, compassionate, supportive environments to get what they need at whatever stage they are in their journey. That's really important. And in the absence of that, the other thing that I notice is I get calls from parents over and over and over again who've lost their precious one. And what I notice is oftentimes those parents have gone to incredible lengths, often taking their children out of the British Columbia, and if they have the means, taking them into involuntary treatment someplace else. And what I hear from the parents is that sense of incredible desperation, and over again they say, I didn't get any help. I saw when my child was 11 or 12 that they were experiencing things in school or in their relationships or in their ability to learn and participate in recreation or whatever, and things weren't right. And I tried to get help and I didn't get the help. I couldn't understand. So for me, I think that's another example of how important it is when we think about what we're trying to create together, is to think about all those different points in which we could connect meaningfully with families and with the people who love young people, and with the young people themselves, and not forget how to build those connections, because it does get back to how important belonging is, belonging to people, place, culture, and community. And if we don't create those opportunities, and then really what we're doing in many of our systems actually create unbelonging, in the wise words of Dr. Mountain Broken Leg. Our systems create unbelonging. And then that becomes an impediment to any kind of healing and growth. So just wanted to speak in that as we think about this, it's also important to think about who else is around that child.
Much like the solutions to youth homelessness living at the community level, I believe that the solutions to harm reduction for young people also live at the community level. How do we continue to ensure that the youth sector remains as part of this discourse and remains as part of this conversation so we don't lose sight of harm reduction for young people under the age of 18?
I think it's so important that when I talk about all the support structures around the youth, I'm also talking about the process that we're going through today around decolonization. And decolonization for me is really around the shifting of power of the institutions that have came to be and brought us today to where we are. And I think a part of that puzzle is also the school districts. I really believe that the parent advisory committees and the parents and the schools need to shift and give some power to the idea of harm reduction for the youth in the schools. And I think that would be super helpful.
Love it.
I think about in the youth homeless sector itself, how the sector could engage with youth and actually co-develop harm reduction policies for housing, and really so that it's done in a youth-friendly way. And I think that would just be so aligned with the principles of harm reduction that it is engaging with people who use substances, and we need to take those same principles up and could co-create those policies instead of thinking, oh no, we've got youth, we can't have substances, they're underage. Well, no, we can figure it out. Youth are smart.
I have ideas.
I like
Anyone else on this one?
I think shelters create the illusion that people are being housed. It's not housing. That's not a home. If we don't build housing for youth, for people who are homeless, that is probably the most stabilizing aspect of change in somebody's lives, is having a safe place to go. Because I always explain this to people, try sleeping on the street. That's not sleep. You don't get to sleep. You don't get an enjoyable sleep. It's not like a place where your body actually rests or your mind rests. You're always up. You sleep with one eye open because you have to protect yourself. And so we create temporary housing. How is that stabilizing anybody's life? And then we point fingers because they're loitering or they're on the street. Well, the truth is there's nowhere to go. And that's a byproduct of us trying to spend the minimum amount of dollars to expect the maximum amount of results. And that is on our governments, not just provincially, but federally. That's on us as human beings to challenge that, to speak about that, and to ask, like, you know how kids are? We have to really think how youth are, because youth don't ask one question. They ask 30 questions. And my kids are in the why stage right now. So every question I ask, government officials off the hook with one question. I always feel that I've left and I've asked a question and I'm like, did they actually answer the question? I don't feel like I got the answer that I was looking for. So we have to know, but what about this? What about that? And really, even our journalists only get 2 questions. You want to know why? Because they don't want another question to come after it. And so we have to keep asking questions to people and hold them accountable for what they're saying.
That and remind people that there is a select standing committee on health that is meeting now in province of British Columbia, taking a look at the recent coroner's report and the action that's going to that recommendations for responding to the toxic drug supply. So I took the opportunity to take a look at the presentations thus far. Hardly any mention of youth. So when we think about action and trying to ensure that the decision makers are thinking about our young people, then again, that's on us. So I think there are going to be opportunities to do submissions and have other presentations going forward. And I think that it's really, really important that those of us who care deeply about youth and see the unique needs of young people need to be speaking to those kinds of decision makers as well, because otherwise the decisions won't reflect the needs of our young people, and we'll continue to have this very polarized view.
Well, I just spoke there yesterday, and don't worry, I brought up all about youth.
It's great. They didn't have the transcripts from yesterday, so I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you.
Say one quick thing about the difference between housing, just putting the folks into a house, versus a supportive recovery program or threshold housing or lighthouse housing, in that I have youth who are just housed. And housing is a commodity. And these youth it's like it's being traded. Instead of having to trade food for drugs or trade sex for drugs or steal, they're trading their house. And now their houses are filled with folks that are 2 times their age. And there's shenanigans that you wouldn't believe occurring in there. And so it's not just housing, it's the need for people to be at the housing, supportive people, harm reduction. In its pure form would be to have a housing site that has adults there that will care for these kids, because a lot of our kids don't have parents that are involved anymore, and they're alone, and they have our team, or they have the Lighthouse staff, or Alliance, or Sanctuary, but we need more.
We're all better because of this conversation. And so in closing, I'd ask you all to share maybe what are the most tangible elements that we can walk away from tonight with, in your own words?
can start. About a couple of weeks ago, I was in Port Hardy and visiting some harm reduction programs there, and there was a youth, maybe about 13, crossing the street. I think going to school, because it was like about 9 in the morning, had a backpack on and had a naloxone kit hanging from the backpack. And I was like, wow, look at that. That is normalized for, he didn't have to hide it. It didn't mean he was using drugs. Maybe it was for him, maybe it was for his friends. I thought that's great. And then my next thought was, why do we have to have harm reduction? We have to have harm reduction because of prohibition. And so I think one of the takeaways, a lot of us have talked about policy, is for people to really learn how the criminalization of drugs was a direct response to race riots in Vancouver. It is completely embedded in colonialism. And continues to perpetuate that. And so we need to learn that history, because that's why we have such an unsafe, unregulated drug market that's killing people. And it's why that youth has to carry naloxone to school. I'm glad he does, but we got to change that policy.
Kim.
By the end. I would just like to say that when you see the youth on the side of the road or when you see them on the meridian, don't ignore them. They don't choose to do this. They weren't born thinking, oh, when I'm 16 or 15 or 12, I'm going to be on the street. They need us to look at them and see them. And we need to be proactive. I know this is a cliche, but write the newspaper and post online and do the new things, the Facebook things, and say what you see, because so much stigma and so much unkindness is perpetuated on these most delicate, resilient folks. And it is heartbreaking. And I would like to empower you to do something like that. Just once even, because you do it once and someone else does it and so on and so on. But we truly honor and respect the youth that we work with. They're amazing, amazing folks. And I just would like you to appreciate some of that.
I think it's so important that we've had this conversation, and I appreciate everybody for being here, and I thank everybody that's been up here, sitting here, having this conversation. It's so important for us to think about stepping out of our comfort zones as an Indigenous person and also as a human being. I would like to say that what we've done so far hasn't worked, and the youth are reflecting that back to us in a huge way. So please step out of your comfort zone, whether that means writing that letter to the government person or stop and have a conversation with the youth that you see on the street, or starting up a committee or going to your parent advisory committee meeting, talking to your superintendent. Step out of your comfort zone, because what we've been doing so far for our youth, it's not working. Thank you.
Thank you for the words and for the perspectives. And of course, I operate in the realm of policy, regulation, legislation, and systems change. But the takeaway for me, I mentioned earlier that it was Dr. Penny Perry who many, many years ago taught me about child and youth care and how to show up. And it's been her teachings and many others, but her teachings have guided me. And Guy, you really reminded me of her and her teaching. And one of the things she said was, every moment matters. Every moment matters, and every moment is an opportunity to build a relationship. So the story that you shared of your grandmother and the persistence And the moments that you shared where somebody said, "I care, Guy," that is something that, again, reminds me that I can work here and I have to work here too. And every moment matters in relationship with our young people. So thank you for that gift.
Take us home, Guy.
I mean, I often just look back and you believed until I believed. And there was always that thing with a person who's struggling with, low self-esteem, anxiety, no coping mechanisms. But when people believed and encouraged me, I kept trying, I kept showing up. And even though it might not have been the result, believe me, it wasn't the result that I wanted, but I kept going. And one of the best stories that I have is that how many times a day do people walk through your lives and check in and say hello? And how many times a day do we actually walk down the street and see somebody that's homeless or struggling and we don't look them in the eye and say hi? We look on the ground or we look somewhere else. It's sometimes a simple hello, a coffee. Hey, I see you, man. That changes people's lives. And I often reflect that we look at people who are struggling with homelessness and poverty as it's like, disposable. Well, I'll tell you something. The beauty is that when I'm taking my kids through the downtown east side of Vancouver, you hear a big thundering voice from somebody yelling, "Kids on the block." You know what that means? That means put your stuff away. There's children in our presence. Even people in the midst of their own struggles have enough to realize that nobody wants this for anybody. And that care and that compassion shows the beauty of people, even in the midst of their struggles. They still care. And even when they're talking to me with my kids and they'll swear, they'll apologize. And I laugh because I'll say, well, they hear me swear, so don't worry about that. But I can sit at Pigeon Park with all the traffic going on around them and my two kids eating a peanut butter sandwich. They don't see anything else. They just see people. And how we view it as society jades our children to grow up in a way of becoming judgmental or there's something wrong. Why are they doing that? And so remember that how we view and teach will either hinder our youth or it will support them. So don't be so judgmental. Be better, do better, and celebrate people because they are trying. Thanks.
On behalf of Making the Shift, Youth Homelessness Social Innovation Lab, and Away Home Canada, co-sponsors for this event, I want to thank you all for your time. I want to thank our friend Colin and Threshold Housing for creating space for this dialogue, for the educational opportunity, and for the mentorship. Turn it over to you.
We're at the end of our time. I hope it was valuable. I hope that everybody took something new from today. To take Marlene's advice that we've been motivated to get out of our comfort zones, to learn more about this topic, to understand where we can influence or agitate or help to create change. I thought it was, it's something I'll take away is Guy saying, let's not just celebrate the outcome, let's celebrate the trying. I think that's a really important perspective we need to try to embed. I want to thank, it was important, Threshold hosted this because we knew it's important subject matter. Our staff and our partners and so on are doing our best, and Kim, the work that you're doing, but we need policy change. We need more, and we need to provoke this conversation. It needs, this can't be one event and gone. This is the start of more dialogue and more conversation. We'll try to do our part, and as we hope we do yours. We wanted to make it a free event, and it is, with, live stream and recordings that'll be accessible for everyone. There should be no barrier to receiving the gift of what was tonight. But part of making that possible for us, I want to thank our sponsors, Making the Shift, Peninsula Co-op, Stream of Consciousness, who's running the live stream for us, Victoria Buzz and the Zone 91.3 just thank you for helping make this possible. I do want, my last thing I'll say is I'll end on this. There are pockets of hope and goodness out there. Threshold has recently partnered with Island Health to open up a youth recovery home here. It's not far from where we are right now. There are 5 or 6 youth there right now who are safe and at home in an environment that is offering belonging, not judgment, 24/7 staffing. Right now, as we're here, they're at Cirque du Soleil because somebody donated some tickets. And they were excited about it, man. Let me tell you. Last night, somebody had a fun idea to say, let's do Halloween in June. So they did, and they dressed up and they went and got candy and it's working and there's goodness there. And so I just want to acknowledge that, know that we just need to keep pushing for more. So thank you to all of you for what you mean in our community, your work, your impact. Deeply grateful. And with that, we'll close the night. Thanks, everyone.